Okay, this is Ajahn Chah week, so thought I would read a little bit from Venerable Father, which is a portrait of Ajahn Chah, and see how it goes. I'm not sure how much I'll read of it, but it's a very lively and realistic portrait of Ajahn Chah as a person, as a teacher, and it's quite well done. Some of you here may have read it. It's by Paul Breiter, Venerable Father, A Life with Ajahn Chah, and he talks. The reason I wanted to read from this as well is it kind of highlights a lot of what the practice is about in terms of the kind of things monks, junior monks, or people who ordained with Ajahn Chah would go through, and just the kind of mental states they have to deal with, and the kind of qualities that Ajahn Chah recommended they cultivate. But also it highlights the practice life or the Dhamma life of Wat Pah Pong at that time. Things like they would have these Sangha meetings, and then Ajahn Chah would bring up things like, I'm not happy with how people are bowing. People need to bow more properly, like rather than like some sort of really heavy issue or something. He would talk about how people should be bowing, and then another monk would bring up, like, people are nodding too much during the Wanpra, and that's like the kind of thing that would come up during these Sangha meetings. So he talks about just the sort of daily grind and how, taking that in, we can develop an attitude, like a lighthearted attitude toward practice, because if we don't have the right attitude, it can become pretty grim. So this being Ajahn Chah week, and culminating in January 16th is the Ajahn Chah Memorial Day. So read this, and then probably some teachings of Ajahn Chah from the collected works in the subsequent days. December 1982. If I've ever genuinely loved anyone, it was Ajahn Chah. He's dying now, and it's unlikely that I'll ever see him again. But I'll never forget him, and I think it would be appropriate to make a formal expression of my gratitude. To put it quite simply, he gave me back my life. It's very possible that he was the only person in the world who could have done it. There are a few people who know that this is not an exaggeration. I think that it was November 18th. The year was 1970. I had been ordained as a novice in a large Buddhist temple in Bangkok for 2 months. A dreary gray afternoon, in a dreary place, in a dreary life. I had just read a dreary letter from a friend at home and was feeling rather depressed, which wasn't anything unusual for me in those days. There were a few other Western prisoners of Buddha living in the temple, or Wat as it's called in Thai, and we usually met in the afternoon to drink coffee and pass time. When I came out of my room, someone asked me what I wanted to drink. Hemlock, I said. There wasn't any hemlock, so I settled for cocoa. And then someone came into the room and said, Ajahn Chah is in Bangkok. Do you want to go see him? We had heard about Ajahn Chah from 2 enthusiastic American monks who had just been with him for several months, and life in his monastery sounded much more humane and livable than under the other masters we had been told about. He was staying in a school building. It was a far cry from the plush accommodations that in a few years he wouldn't be able to avoid whenever he came to Bangkok. But at that time, he wasn't yet too well known. He and 2 monks slept under their mosquito nets on mats on the bare floor. We had an interpreter, Suijano Bhikkhu, soon to disrobe and return to his life as Dr. Burns, an independent-minded, scientific, skeptical type who had checked out several teachers, decided on Ajahn Chah, and summarized a description of his time spent at Wat Pah Pong, Ajahn Chah's monastery, by saying, "Hell, I'm impressed with the guy." He disappeared in the jungle in southern Thailand in 1976. But that hardly mattered to me. I was overwhelmed by his radiant, exuberant happiness. I had really never seen anyone like that. He seemed like a big, happy frog sitting on his lily pad, and I thought, if all you have to do to be like that is sit in the forest for 30 years, it's worth it. So there was hope after all. We newly ordained people had been led to understand that it was necessary to get a foundation of study and meditation, which meant spending a year in a Bangkok temple, before one could go to practice in a forest monastery. Ajahn Chah's words were, You're welcome to come and live at my temple any time, if you think you can endure it." I remember how my spirits were lifted then. In the car going back to the Wat, I was thinking, there's hope. The practice of meditation and the Buddhist monk's way of life, both of which I found so difficult, much more difficult than anything I had ever done, thought of doing, or heard of anyone else doing, can produce results. Seeing a living example was worth more than reading any number of books. So I thought, in a few months I will go there. The terrors of the forest Wat were still rather intimidating to think about, so I felt better putting it off to some unspecified time in the future. But then one night, as I sat in meditation, the dogs started howling again and shattered my concentration. The city Wat was pretty noisy, so I would wait until things had settled down and monks and temple boys were going to sleep so that I wouldn't be disturbed by laughter, singing, boxing matches, loud conversations, and radios. And around 10 p.m. I would begin my meditation. But the dogs hadn't gone to sleep. There are dozens of them in every city Wat. Anonymous people bring them there so that they won't be picked up off the streets and exterminated. Any hour of the night, one of them might start barking or howling, and the others would join in. And this time I got very upset and thought, I can't meditate here. I'm going to Wat Pah Pong. Within a few days, I took the overnight train to Ubon. Monks and novices are supposed to sit up on a train and can't take food after noon. The Wat I ordained at still kept the Vinaya rules, so that I couldn't carry money to buy soft drinks for myself either. During those 11 hours, I thought about a lot of things. I could go to India, live a simple life by the ocean at Goa, eat 3 meals a day and meditate. But the little voice kept saying, "Where will you go? What will you do?" As would usually happen, someone at the train station put me in a taxi for the 6-kilometer ride to the Wat. I got there as the monks were starting to get back from Bindabat, alms round. First I met Dr. Burns, still a monk, and Dhammaguto, the English novice who had come with him a few days before. Then the American monk, Sumedho, who had been there for a few years. Sumedho's presence there was one of the, quote, attractions, unquote, of Wat Pah Pong. From what we'd heard of him, he was much different from any of the veteran Western bhikkhus we'd met. He had benefited from monk's life, had overcome doubt and hesitation, and had a down-to-earth approach. In addition, he could speak Thai and was willing to help new people. One of the novices had written to him, and in his reply he described conditions at Wat Pah Pong and the way Ajahn Chah taught, using the monk's way of life as a tool to develop mindfulness, meditation as a way of life. He said that Ajahn Chah welcomed those who really wanted to practice. After the meal, I was given a kuti in the forest, a simple wood structure with a small porch, raised on pillars as everything is in the countryside. Sumedho helped me carry water for the bathroom, talked with me a little, and invited me to come see him in the evening. The forest was certainly peaceful. It was winter. The weather was pleasant and clear. The sunlight filtering through the trees, the dirt paths, the leaves everywhere. I remember so clearly how it would calm the mind again and again, take me out of my inner turmoil for a while. There was nothing there, nothing to distract or amuse one, nothing to do, just meditate. The kuti was empty, only a mat and pillow. The walls and floor were bare. In the afternoon, the bell rang and everyone went to draw water from a well and carry it on bamboo poles to wherever it was needed in the monastery. Then later I bathed at another well near my kuti. I went to Sumedo's kuti. He lit a fire outside, made tea, and we sat on his porch with a tiny kerosene lamp and talked. He told me his story, and I told him mine. I had left home 1.5 years before to travel and find true happiness. I thought I knew what I needed, and one by one I found out that my ideas were wrong. As months went by, and I went from place to place and experience to experience, frustration and despair built up. Across Europe, across Asia, nothing external really seemed to help. Everywhere, people basically seemed to be the same. He laughed when I said I found the whole world seething with discontent. Nobody anywhere really seemed to have any certainty. After 5 months in Nepal, I decided to go to Indonesia for one last try, then back home for a while, then more travel, and then? But a series of coincidences, beginning with a case of meningitis just as I was ready to leave Nepal, left me listening to a talk on Buddhism in a temple on my first day in Bangkok. Immediately I knew that this was what I had been looking for, and within a month I was in robes and had a new name, Warapanyo. I had expected to spend 3 days in Thailand, but it was to stretch into 7 years by the time I was ready to cash in my chips. Sumedo said he had become happy and peaceful through living as a monk. His awareness increased as the years passed, and he only wished to continue living that way. He said, "You won't find a better teacher than Ajahn Chah in Thailand. You might find one as good, but you won't find better." He had looked for faults in the man for 2 years, and he didn't find any, so he finally gave up. He said, "I really love Ajahn Chah, like a father." He added, "I love my father too, that's filial piety, but my father doesn't have wisdom." He laughed. There it was. Sitting up there on the porch in the peace of the forest night, I felt that here was a place beyond the suffering and confusion of the world, the Vietnam War, the meaninglessness of life in America and everywhere else, the pain and desperation of those I had met on the road in Europe and Asia who were so sincerely looking for a better way of life but not finding it. This man, in this place, seemed to have found it, and it seemed entirely possible that others could as well. Ajahn Chah was away at that time, but the days passed just the same. In the morning, long before dawn, I would walk to the hall, the sala, for chanting and meditation, wondering how people could live like this, not even a cup of coffee through the whole morning before the meal. In the afternoon, I would be dreading the cold bath for at least an hour in advance. After that, I would be back in my kuti, all alone with my restless mind. I would think about friends and other places, wondering if there wasn't any other way to peace and happiness, a way that didn't leave a person so exposed and defenseless. And I knew that there wasn't for me, and I consoled myself by thinking, when I'm an old man, I'll be glad I did this. There was a cold spell for a week, and I really suffered with my thin cotton robe. In the morning on Pindabat, the cold and wind penetrated to the bone. At night in the drafty kuti, 1 or 2 light blankets weren't nearly enough to enable me to sleep comfortably. And always the thought haunted me, is this what I have to do for the rest of my life? The food was pretty good at that time of year, but I was so afraid of letting myself indulge in this one pleasure left to a monk that I would mix everything together in my alms bowl, curries, sweets, rice, fruit, fish, stirring it all together as I'd been told meditation monks do. The Thai novices who sat near me could hardly bear to look. Eventually, I was to find out what a friendly and good-hearted bunch of people the monks and novices were, but at first I just found them strange and irritating. The strange faces, the smiles, the questions I couldn't understand, the way they'd interrupt when I was talking to Sumedo at the well to ask him what I did before coming to Thailand or something like that. I could speak a few phrases of Thai, but not enough to converse. Dhammaguto and I went to visit Sumedo on some evenings, and after Ajahn Chah came back, we saw him a few times. But most nights I would just return to my kuti after chanting and continue with my sitting and walking meditation. One night I sat inside the kuti and I heard noises outside. It was just the wild chickens rustling in the leaves, but I convinced myself that it was communist guerrillas. I sat perfectly still and listened. Instead of going outside for my usual walking meditation, I bolted the door, blew out my candle, and tried not to make any noise. I think I figured it out the next day when I saw the chickens in the forest, but it all seemed very real at the time. The first time we saw Ajahn Chah, there were several monks there, but since we were new arrivals, he gave us an audience. Through Suvijano, he gave us instruction on meditation and answered questions. He added that the forest Wat was much more conducive to practicing. In the city Wat, it's like trying to meditate in the marketplace, whereas just by living in the forest, half the job is done already. The Buddha was born in the forest, he said. He practiced in the forest. He was enlightened in the forest. He taught in the forest, and he died in the forest. I was to hear that often over the years. One time, the following year, when I had made yet another request for bhikkhu ordination, he said through Sumedho, "There's no need to hurry. The Buddha died under the trees." As he spoke, he was always smiling, laughing, pouring himself another glass of tea, rubbing balm on himself, so full of life, so happy. One night, as we came back from his kuti, Dhammaguto remarked about him, and Sumedho said, "I imagine this is what Gotama must have been like. He's unconcerned." After I arrived at Wat Pah, we heard he was in the south and couldn't return on schedule because of heavy rains, and I had an image of him sitting in a jeep, stuck in the rain somewhere, happy as could be, undaunted by the situation and thoroughly enjoying himself. One evening, when I visited Sumedho at his kuti, he asked me how my practice was going. Well, it was good when I first came to the forest, but lately I had trouble concentrating. Various thoughts kept coming up. He told me not to get caught up in evaluating and worrying about things, or else you just start thinking, I'm this way, I'm that way, and all of that is just more self. He spoke in ordinary, down-to-earth language. Ajahn Chah's way, he said, is padi padi. Find out what's just right for you in terms of food, sleep, hours of formal meditation. Don't cling to ideals. There was a man who was an alcoholic who came to the Wat frequently. He had been a bhikkhu for 6 years. It was he who had first brought Sumedho to Wat Pah, and was extremely diligent in the discipline and formal practice, but he was never really observing his own mind, just clinging to an external form. So he never cut through his defilements or developed wisdom, and he ended up disrobing and going downhill quickly. There was another monk, an Indonesian man, who was overly keen on, quote, meditating, unquote. Ajahn Chah told him not to even bother doing formal meditation practice, but to work and chant and so forth along with everyone else, and just be aware of himself. He learned to relax and observe himself. I met him in Bangkok later on, and he spoke very highly of Ajahn Chah, Sumedho, and Wat Pah. The practice of concentration was to develop mindfulness, which was vice versa from what I had heard from other Western monks, who felt that one had to reach a certain high level of concentration before anything could really happen in practice. Sumedho said that the practice of constant mindfulness led to a state of balance, and that's what the goal is. He talked of the way Ajahn Chah had handled him. When he first came, he only wanted to sit and meditate, and when he had to do work, it made him unhappy. Sometimes when sweeping leaves, he would just stand there, broom in hand, thinking unhappily. Once Ajahn Chah saw him and said, "Sumedho, is the suffering in the broom? Is the suffering in the leaves?" He eventually got the point. Once he decided he didn't like the location of his kuti. He wanted one in a more isolated spot. Ajahn Chah said okay, but there was a catch. He could stay in the one he wanted for the daytime, but at night he'd have to go back and sleep in the original kuti. After a few days of going back and forth, he realized that Ajahn Chah was trying to teach him something, to accept things as they are, and not create further complications for himself with his desires, which are always changing anyhow. He realized what the real source of the problem was, and stayed in his assigned kuti. I was involved in a similar caper the following winter. It was getting cold, and a monk who was leaving suggested that his kuti might be a bit more comfortable since it was smaller and less drafty, so I moved. but it was near the wall of the Wat, and the farmers would pass by with their buffaloes in the daytime. This disturbed me, because I was still convinced that meditation and noise don't mix. So after a few days, I moved back. Someone noticed, of course. The CIA has nothing on the monastic grapevine, and duly reported it to Ajahn Chah. He questioned me about it, and over the years I was to hear the story many times, expanded and embellished. He would often use incidents like this, somewhat tailored to fit his purpose, to teach. He would tell people about learning the mind's tricks, how it becomes bored and dissatisfied, always wanting something else. Take Warapanyo, for example. He came to Wat Pah and was sitting in his kuti, but he wasn't happy. He moved all his things and went to live in the other kuti, but he wasn't happy there either. So he thought the first kuti was better, and he moved back there. He always told the stories in a very gentle and funny way. Everyone would have a good laugh, and he would make his point. It's the mind that does it all. Know your mind. One of the things Ajahn Chah emphasized was endurance. There's nothing to it, just endurance, he often said. And in speaking of Sumedho, Suijano had said, basically the guy just had guts, and that was the key to his success. Sumedho himself said that illness had been a great teacher, forcing him to cut through doubts and habitual attitudes of fear and self-pity. After his first year at Wat Pah, he went off to live by himself on a hilltop in Sakonnakhon province. His leg got infected and he got a fever. He couldn't walk, so in the daytime the villagers would come and carry him down the hill to another kuti. Sitting there under the tin roof, sweating, with little gnats flying in his eyes and ears, he started feeling sorry for himself, thinking how his mother would be taking care of him if he were at home, bringing him ice cream, etc. Then after being totally lost in self-pity, he thought, here I am, a 34-year-old man wanting his mother. He sat up straight and started saying to himself, let go, and kept on saying it until he actually did let go. Things were different for him after that. Sumedho is now Ajahn Sumedho, abbot of a thriving monastic community in England. But he's always been quite a modest fellow, so I hope you won't mind that I'm writing about him like this. I take the liberty because he has been so instrumental in transmitting Ajahn Chah's way. First, because his presence inspired so many people to stay at Wat Pah, and later because he was the only one capable of going to the West to teach. One of the terrors of the forest I had contemplated with dread while still in Bangkok was that of creatures such as snakes and spiders. One morning, returning to my kuti after the meal, I walked by Sumedho's. He was on the porch, shouting. As I got near, he said there was a beautiful snake, which had jumped off the porch when he came and slithered into the forest, that he wanted me to see. I soon learned that snakes don't bother you unless you step on them, or corner or provoke them. And I think I did see one or two on that visit. My immediate reaction was calm. Oh, there's a snake. They're usually nice to look at. And after that, I was never much concerned about them. After about 2.5 weeks, it was time for me to return to Bangkok for renewal of my visa. Although life in the forest is much calmer than in the city, it was somewhat of a relief to leave. Often one doesn't really recognize the benefits while there, but after leaving it is seen in perspective. Something opened up for me, and over the following weeks, my meditations seemed to improve rapidly. After 2 months, I was finally ready to cut the umbilical cord and go to spend the rest of my days in the forest, or so I thought. I returned with Dhammaguto. Ajahn Chah was away again, and Sumedho had gone to stay at a mountain temple in another district, Wat Tumseng Pet, the cave of diamond light. We were soon sent there. It was a magnificent place, covering several hundred acres, with kutis on the hillside, some in caves, and a huge sala being built on the top. There were only about 10 monks and novices. It was very quiet. Being 3 kilometers from the nearest village, Almsround was an invigorating 2 to 2.5 hour walk. Group activity and practice were minimal, so we had a lot of time to ourselves. Occasionally I would talk with Sumedho. He constantly spoke of the changeability of things, In one's practice, there are peaks of inspiration, and then there are valleys of despair. I was feeling pretty sure of myself for a while, and when he once said that the desire to disrobe returns periodically, I thought, not for me. I've gotten beyond that. And before long, everything started exploding and falling apart for me. Since this is intended to be about Ajahn Chah, I won't go into too much detail about my own personal story, as fascinating as it may be. Suffice it to say that everything I thought I had developed quickly crumbled, and a seemingly bottomless hole of desperation opened up. Sumedo urged me to see it through. He said I was really getting down to the roots of things, that sometimes all you can do is grit your teeth and endure, and that once it passes, as all things do, you are left with a deep understanding of impermanence that will see you through anything. Although there was no way out of it, I ran. I went back to Wat Pah Pong and then to Bangkok. Ajahn Chah had visited us briefly at Wat Tam Sang Pet. It was afternoon, we were outside, and he came up to me and looked me over. He felt my ribs with a very concerned look on his face, remarked how skinny I'd gotten. It was not only my mind that had been freaking out. For many months afterwards, I remembered that look of concern. In Bangkok, things got even worse, to the point where I finally decided that I would go back to the forest and die there, if it came to that, rather than return to the city again. But by the time I had come to that decision, the rains residence, Vasa, or Pansa in Thai, had begun, and for a period of 3 months we had to remain where we were. I counted the days. I was, of course, terrified of returning, but remembering the way Ajahn Chah looked so compassionately concerned about me gave me a little thread of hope and warmth to hold on to. The night before I left Wat Pah Pong for Bangkok, I went to see him with Satimanto, an American novice who could speak enough Thai to translate for me. Ajahn Chah was sitting alone with a Chinese man from town and his small son. The man looked the picture of domestic happiness, and I thought, maybe I could live that way. But one look at Ajahn Chah, sitting above us on his seat, and there was no basis for any kind of comparison. The happiness he knew was so far beyond the joys and sorrows of the householder's life. In fact, the next evening, I was in town well ahead of the train's departure time, and I was taken to the same layman's house to wait. It was not so idyllic. Grandma, wife, and kids sat among heaps of clothes and junk watching a boxing match on TV with the volume turned all the way up. So much for my fantasies about lay life. During the Pansa, Satimanto became very ill and had to disrobe. Meanwhile, another young American who had been in the Peace Corps in Africa, who was passing through Bangkok, realized that he was a Buddhist, ordained, and was given the name Satimanto. I met him when he came to visit my temple in Bangkok. He was looking for a forest wat and decided to give Wat Pah Pong a try, so we took the train together the day after the Pansa ended. I mentioned some of these people to give an idea of the steady stream of Westerners passing through the temples of Thailand. Some ordain, some don't. Some stay for a short or long time, some don't ever leave. For every person mentioned here, there are a few who go unmentioned. Often these people turn up again a few years after leaving, in Bangkok, at Wat Pah Pong, at Sumedo's place in England, or at Buddhist centers in the U.S. As the train neared Warin, the end of the line, the rice paddies, the simple villages, and the monks from Wat Pah Pong on Pindabat were a welcome sight. When we got to Wat Pah Pong and went to pay respects to Ajahn Chah, the first thing he said was, "Warapanyo's come back. I thought he was afraid of sticky rice." Khao niao, the glutinous rice, which is the staple of the diet in northeast Thailand, indigestible for some people. It was the month for Katina, the ceremony at which laypeople offer robe material to the monks at the end of the rain's residence. Wat Pah Pong is one of the few places left where monks still cut, sew, and dye their own robes, as well as make all their other equipment, some of it quite intricate. Ajahn Chah has always insisted on preserving this tradition. In most places in Thailand, he once remarked, the only people who still know how to make robes are the Chinese tailors in the marketplace. There are many branch monasteries of Wat Pah Pong. and the monks would travel from one to the other to take part in the ceremonies, visit friends, check out wats they hadn't yet been to. Ajahn Chah got on the circuit too, and Wat Bapong became pretty quiet. I spent a lot of time in my kuti, meditating and wondering with trepidation what would become of me. The food got leaner, the weather got colder, and I envisioned a life of walking and sitting meditation, enduring hunger and fatigue, hardly ever talking to anyone. One cold afternoon, as we swept the monastery grounds with the long-handled wooden brooms, I thought how nice would it be, what a simple thing it really was, if we could have a drink of sugary coffee or tea after working like that, to warm the bones and give us a little energy for meditating at night. But alas, it was like an old friend you know you will never see again. Romanticizing the situation always makes it a little easier. But with Ajahn Chah away, even the occasional evening refreshment was not forthcoming. I had heard that Western monks in the forest tend to get infatuated with sweets, and finally the dam burst. One morning on Pindabat, from the moment I walked out of the gate of the Wat to the moment I came back in, about an hour and a half, I thought continually about sugar, candy, sweets, pastry, chocolate. Finally, I sent a letter to a lay supporter in Bangkok to send me some palm sugar cakes, and I waited. I tell you this silly story because it in part led up to the moment when Ajahn Chah took me under his wing. It is also representative of the comedy of errors which was the early part of my monastic career. Katina season ended and Ajahn Chah returned. The weeks went by. One day I went down with a layman to get medicine. We stopped by the post office and my long-awaited package was there. It was huge and the ants were already at it. When I got back to the Wat, I made the obligatory stop at Ajahn Chah's kuti. He asked about my trip to town, if I'd been able to find the medicine, and finally, what was this box I brought back? It was a little embarrassing, as the ants were a pretty clear indication of some extracurricular activity on my part. The various spectators were examining it and concluded that there must be some kind of sweet in it on account of the ants, but not yet having opened it, I just mumbled that it was from a layman in Bangkok. Then, when I finally escaped to the privacy of my kuti, I opened the box. There were 20 to 25 pounds of palm sugar cakes. I went wild, stuffing them down until my stomach ached. Then I thought I should share some, since word was more or less out, and I might get myself pretty sick if I kept them all. So I put some aside and took the rest to Ajahn Chah's kuti. He had the bell rung, and all the monks and novices came, and everyone enjoyed a rare treat. That night I ate more with an American monk visiting from Bangkok, and the next night I couldn't control myself. The sugar cakes were devouring me. My blessings started to seem like a curse. So I took the cakes in a plastic bag and decided to go around to monks' kutis and give them away. For a start, I fell down my stairs and bruised myself nicely. The wooden stairs can get slippery in cold weather, and I wasn't being very mindful in my guilty, distressed state of mind. The first kuti I went to had a light on inside, but I called and there was no answer. Finally, after calling several times and waiting, the monk timidly asked who it was. I didn't yet understand how strong the fear of ghosts is among Thai people. I offered him some sugar. He asked me why I didn't want to keep it for myself. I tried to explain about my defiled state of mind. He took one. It was hard to get him to take too much, as it is considered to be in very bad taste to display one's desires or anger. I repeated this with others, having little chats along the way. One monk, Kamun, seemed to be a little older and better educated than the other junior monks. I asked him where his home was, as a way of initiating a conversation with my limited Thai. "My home is here," he said. "If I go stay in another Wat, then that's my home. It's very simple." I asked about his past. He had been a civil servant, married, was living pretty comfortably, but as time went by, he began to feel it was all somewhat meaningless, so he decided to ordain. He'd been in robes for 3 years and didn't wish to return to lay life. But the hour grew late, and although I hadn't unloaded all the sugar, I headed back to my kuti. My flashlight batteries were almost dead, so I lit matches to try to have a view of the path. There are lots of poisonous things creeping and crawling around the forest. I ran into some black army ants and experienced my first fiery sting, which felt like a thorn being pushed into my foot. The warnings about these little critters were not exaggerations. I got back to my kuti feeling very foolish. In the morning, I took the rest of the cakes and gave them to a senior monk who I felt would have the wisdom and self-discipline to be able to handle them. I went to see Ajahn Chah in the afternoon to confess my sins. I felt like it was all over for me. There was no hope left. He was talking with one old monk. I made the customary 3 prostrations, sat down and waited. When he acknowledged me, I blurted out, "I'm impure, my mind is soiled, I'm no good." He looked very concerned. "What is it?" he asked. I told him the story. Naturally, he was amused, and within a few minutes I realized that he had me laughing. I was very lighthearted. The world was no longer about to end. In fact, I had forgotten about my burden. This was one of his most magical gifts. You could feel so burdened and depressed and hopeless, and after being around him for a few minutes, it all vanished, and you found yourself laughing. Sometimes you only needed to go and sit down at his kuti, be around him as he spoke to others. Even when he was away, I would get a contact high of peacefulness as soon as I got near his kuti to clean up or sweep leaves. As I type this, I'm reminded of the feeling I would get in the city of Varanasi by the banks of the Ganges, sitting there at night when no people were around, feeling the presence of so many centuries of spirituality. Then he started questioning me. I had been there for almost 2 months at that point. It was late November of 1971, and perhaps he began to think that I was going to stay for a while. He asked me if I didn't want to disrobe, go back to the world, get married, make money, etc., to all of which I replied in the negative. He seemed interested in why I was there. I told him of my hard time in Bangkok and how I had resolved to come and die in the forest rather than go back there. "Die in the forest," he repeated, laughing. He loved to repeat things people said that he thought were funny and enjoy a laugh. I had studied Thai while in Bangkok and was able to maintain the conversation. He was very good at talking to us on the level of language and Dhamma that we could understand. He said in the afternoon, when water hauling is finished, "You can come here and clean up." My first reaction was, he's got a lot of nerve telling me to come and wait on him. But apart from being one of my duties, it was a foot in the door and a privilege. Through it, I was starting to see that there was a way of life in the monastery, rich, structured, and harmonious, and at the center of it all is the teacher, who is someone to be relied upon. And finally he asked, why was I so skinny? Immediately, one of the monks who was there told him that I took a very small ball of rice at the mealtime. Did I not like the food? I told him I just couldn't digest much of the sticky rice, so I kept cutting down. I had come to accept it as the way it was, thinking I was so greedy that eating less and less was a virtue. But he was concerned. Did I feel tired? Most of the time I had little strength, I admitted. So he said, I'm going to put you on a special diet for a while, just plain rice gruel and fish sauce to start with. You eat a lot of it and your stomach will stretch out, and then we'll go to boiled rice and finally to sticky rice. I'm a doctor, he added. I found out later that he actually was an accomplished herbalist, as well as having knowledge of the various illnesses monks are prone to. He told me not to push myself too much. I didn't have the strength. If I didn't have the strength, I didn't have to carry water, etc. That was when the magic really began. That was when he was no longer just Ajahn Chah to me. He became Lungpo, Venerable Father. End it there. It probably brings back quite a few memories for you.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, somehow reading that also just sets a tone for something like winter retreat. It's like it can get really kind of grim and sort of my practice.
Yeah, me and my practice, and just trying to get a bigger context on it, and not getting too swept up in one's own mind, and just realize it's just really ordinary. We made big problems out of little things. I was thinking, what comes up is one time.
I don't think they can hear outside.
No, I got it on. Yeah, how's that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, there was a monk got really. I was thinking of Warpanyo and his being surrounded by communist guerrillas and the noises in the forest, and one time one of the monks he heard a noise and he'd shone his flashlight and he'd seen something and he was and then he started calling out to a nearby kuti because he was so terrified of this huge animal that had been there. He was absolutely convinced that it was a bear in the forest, and of course he was fairly new, and he thought. But then the monk who came who was close by said, there are no bears in Wat Pah Pong. and said that. So he said, "Come on, we'll take a look." And took the monk and started looking around. It was a porcupine. So, but, it doesn't take long for a porcupine to turn into a bear in the middle of the night, left with your mind and your fears and your proliferations.
I like how he goes into, he bolted the door and blew out his candles.
Yeah.
Do you remember Dhammaguto? Do you remember this? Or this is
Yes.
even before you remember?
Yes, Dhammaguto I remember, yeah. He was a monk still when early days of Wat Nana Chat. And he's actually done an interview with Ajahn Ñāṇiko for the Wat Pah Nana Chat.
So he's disrobed.
He disrobed. He went back to England and disrobed. And he was around for a few years. He left fairly early on, the early days of Wat Nana Chat, and then came back again as well as a layman, I think. But he's kept his connection with the Sangha in England. And Ajahn Ñāṇiko said it's interesting to, similar to Warpanyo, the recollections of gratitude and example that Dhammaguto mentioned, and actually many of the other people who we've done interviews with, that just recollecting Ajahn Chah and his that it was something that was kind of life-changing for them, meeting somebody like that.
We'll end it there, take a short break before puja.